Hi, welcome back to my channel. You'll notice that I'm doing this video from a very different setting. I'm actually out of town and currently visiting family in Illinois, and therefore you'll see that, of course, the setting is very different from my usual kitchen location where I do most of my videos that are not in the field. So I drove cross country over the course of 3.5 days to avoid airports and airplanes and during the era of COVID. And so for the next couple of videos, you'll likely see that I am doing them from this location here. Okay, so today I want to do a little video explaining the differences between the different categories of public land, primarily federal land. For many people who are just getting into and interested in outdoor recreation, road trips, conservation issues, and other related topics, sometimes are a little bit overwhelmed and and a little confused by the different categories of public lands, particularly the federal lands, which cover a much greater area, though we will touch certainly on state lands as well. Okay, and so to start off with, I'm going to be referencing this map that I've had actually for about 15 years now. It was published and printed in 2002, so it's a little bit old. I actually got it as a grad student in 2004, and but it is a really good comprehensive map that's quite large that goes into detail on the different types of federal lands. And so I will be making reference to this map over the course of this video. So yeah, like I said, a lot of people find it confusing or wonder what exactly is the difference between a national park, a national monument, a national forest, a national recreation area, a wildlife refuge, and many of these other categories that sound kind of similar. People understand that they are large areas of protected wildlands, but protected to what degree? And so that's what we're going to be going over today. Okay. So like I said, we will be referencing this map, right? Of course, it does fold out. And like I said, I've had this for about 15, 16 years. So it is a little bit older, but we're going to just focus on this section right here and look at these different categories. And we'll just look at some West Coast examples here because it really is, as you can see, the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, California, and a little bit of Nevada are close to the legend here. And the West Coast, like the entire western 1/3 of the U.S., westernmost third of the U.S., has vastly more public land than the eastern 2/3. And we'll touch on why that is, of course, as we go through and explain all the differences. So the first thing to talk about is that there are different federal agencies, larger federal agencies, that different land management and land ownership agencies are part of. For example, there is the Department of the Interior, which oversees the National Park Service, the National Fish and Wildlife Service, the Native American Reservations, as well as the Bureau of Land Management. Okay. However, the U.S. Forest Service is actually under the Department of Agriculture, and a lot of it has to do with the distinct differences in terms of why different agencies were originally founded. So we're going to be getting into all that, like I said. So let's first of all talk about the National Park Service, okay, and what different types of land units, are under the National Park Service. So at the highest level, what is probably most well known among most people, of course, are actual national parks, okay? National parks are by far the federally owned and managed lands that most people are familiar with, of course, but also under the National Park Service is in addition to national parks, there are national monuments, there are national recreation areas, there's national historic parks, and national seashores and lakeshores. Again, what's the difference between all of these that we're going to get into? So first off, not going to really focus too much on national historic parks or national historic sites because they tend to be a little bit small in geographic area. some national historic sites might cover an area of hundreds of acres, certainly, depending on what it is. It could be a battlefield, historic battlefield, or anything like that. But still, nonetheless, so they tend to be a little bit small. So we're not going to really be getting into those too much. The main units of the National Park Service that you should be aware of are national parks, national monuments, national seashores and lakeshores, and national recreation areas. So let's take national parks and national monuments. What is the difference between those two? Many national parks originally started off as a national monument. National monuments can be made national monuments by executive order by the president under a law, federal law, that has been in existence since 1906 called the Antiquities Act, established by President Theodore Roosevelt, who is probably, kind of the founder and father of really a lot of the conservation movement within the U.S. as far as U.S. presidents go. Now, national monuments originally, were established to preserve a natural or cultural feature of some kind. So they range certainly from things like Native American archaeological sites, especially, for example, there are many national monuments that preserve things like Anasazi cliff dwellings and around the Four Corners region of Arizona and New Mexico and so forth. But the first national monument ever established was Devil's Tower in the northeast corner of Wyoming, close to the Black Hills, which is mostly in South Dakota, but also straddles into Wyoming. Generally speaking, the national monuments were, again, really kind of designed to preserve one feature, either natural or cultural feature, and then generally expanded their land holdings over time. National monuments, of course, are not solely under national park units. Some national monuments are actually kind of on Bureau of Land Management land, or national forests as well. So it gets a little bit complicated, but essentially they're established by usually by some kind of executive order. Many national monuments, many of our national parks today did start off as national monuments. Joshua Tree National Park and Death Valley, two of the major national desert national parks in California's deserts, were originally national monuments and didn't become national parks actually until my lifetime, I believe the 1990s, 1994 for Joshua Tree. I forgot about Death Valley, but that's just an example. Pinnacles National Park in California, also a very recent example that was a national monument since the days of Theodore Roosevelt from 1908, I believe, or around that first decade of the 20th century. National parks typically get more funding for a lot more recreational facilities. Just by calling it a national park tends to get a lot more visitation. So that's another big difference, is that national parks typically, once something is designated as a national park, it typically has more funding for facilities, campgrounds, maybe lodges, roads, which does bring in more access, but also does bring in more environmental impact. Because although national parks were always established to preserve the natural features and the natural ecosystem, nonetheless, though, if there are some kind of development projects that are intended to serve the public and tourists, well, then that can sort of be built. And so it wasn't until the 1960s that the Wilderness Act came about that really set aside areas as wilderness within different federal lands, which can be found in national parks, national forests, wildlife refuges, and Bureau of Land Management lands. Okay, so what about the other national parks, park units? So there's also national recreation areas. National recreation areas typically are found around a lot of federally built reservoirs where rivers have been dammed, so like the lands that immediately surround it. National recreation areas are typically designed for a little bit higher use of recreational use of the land and are not quite as wilderness. The other examples are national park units that are outside or just on the outskirts of major urban centers, major metropolitan areas in California. This includes the Santa Monica Mountains recreation area, as well as the Golden Gate recreation area around the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, these also tend to be free, whereas many national parks that often have like one road in and one road out obviously charge an entrance fee just to enter for vehicles but national recreation areas, because they tend to be a little bit more fragmented, have a lot more existing roads, they're just free. Okay. So, and then of course there are national lakeshores and seashores. National lakeshores and seashores do include more than just the protected shoreline, but also include the lands, the general coastal lands as well. And of course, some national lakeshores and seashores do eventually become national parks sometimes, but generally speaking, they kind of have the same function. Okay, now. So like I said, in this map, for example, you see green areas indicating national park units. So again, here's Death Valley, that is Yosemite, that is Sequoia and Kings Canyon. And over here, this is the Point Reyes National Seashore, and that is Redwood National Park in far northern California. But you'll also see, of course, here that they have a separate category for a national monument that is kind of like a green outline, but transparent in the middle. And that's, again, because other federal agencies can have national monuments in them. Okay, so and some of those we're going to talk about in a little bit. Now, what about national forests? Okay, so national forests are very different from national parks. The lighter green you see on this map here covers a much greater area. Okay, as well as over here. And you'll see that the kind of somewhat olive green color covers a much, much larger area. Now, what makes national forests different from national parks? Well, they were originally intended to be a forest reserve, intended to be sustainably managed for timber production. They ultimately have always been sort of what we call multiple use. Okay, but because of that, national forests tend to get a lot more opposing interests and opposing parties. But generally, there's, if you want to kind of think of it as three major functions of the U.S. national forests, and that is recreation, conservation, as well as some economic use. Okay, so you do actually have timber harvesting on national forests. However, though, and as well as even some mining claims, however, ever since the 1976 Act, national forests have had to put together a plan. So it's not like timber companies can just go to national forests and say, oh, we want to harvest this. It has to be something that is, you have environmental assessments done, and only certain select areas, only certain types of timber harvesting, whether it's select cutting or in some cases clear cut, but what have you. But the point is that any kind of economic exploitation of anything in national forests basically have to go under some kind of environmental assessment, and also have to, even more so than that, they have to have a whole, like every 4 years or so, there has to be an actual national forest plan. So what does this mean for people who are into outdoor recreation? Generally, national forests have a lot fewer tourists because they're not the highlights, generally speaking. And so there's generally, with a few exceptions, there's generally not going to be any fee to just enter national forests. A lot of roads go through there. You even have small towns and villages within national forest lands. But they are meant to be multiple use. So you do have some areas of recreation, but there's different rules. Some areas you might have allowed to be motorized recreation, others you can't. Some areas are set aside to preserve certain kinds of ecosystems or habitats, especially for rare or endangered species. But anyways, but the point is, though, is of course that there are multiple uses. So national forests are somewhat it's almost like how the city is zoned as commercial, recreational, or commercial, residential, industrial, things like that. That's kind of the way that national forests are also somewhat zoned. So they cover a lot more area. And like I said, we are going to talk a little bit about wilderness areas as well. Okay, so now also keep in mind that under the Department of Agriculture, you also have national grasslands. National grasslands don't cover a very large percentage of the country's public lands, but you do find them in much of the western Great Plains of particularly like in states like parts of eastern Wyoming, eastern Colorado, western parts of South Dakota. So basically the high plains in North Texas and a few other areas. Many of these national grasslands were lands that were maybe at one time privately owned, became national grasslands from the impact of the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. But in any case, they are federal lands, and so they are functional in a similar way to national forests. Okay. So again, that's a big difference between national forests. Again, they cover a lot greater area than national park units. They tend to be more multiple use, but different forests are different. For example, the national forests in the mountains of Southern California, the only timber harvesting that is ever done there is on a very, very small scale for things like firewood, local firewood sales, or if there's maybe a forest fire, there might be some salvage timber harvesting. But I don't know a lot of details about that. Okay, so we covered that. National forests, again, national grasslands, there's a few of those in the high plains. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about Bureau of Land Management, okay? Bureau of Land Management, on many maps of public lands, they're generally going to be kind of a beige color. Well, there's a reason for this, is that beige on many maps are, of course, kind of a universal color for desert lands. And so if you're wondering who or what agency or owns most of the wide open, seemingly empty desert lands that one drives through many of the western states, well, a lot of that is Bureau of Land Management. Okay, now the Bureau of Land Management got their start a little bit different. National Park Service was established to create parks for the public. Okay, they may be parks of vast, unique natural features, but were really meant for the enjoyment of the public. Okay, national forests were meant to as a forest reserve. Again, more multiple use. Bureau of Land Management essentially is a lot of the land that was never homesteaded. Okay, it was a land that was essentially too arid for homesteading. And so it was one of the later agencies to have come about. The National Park Service was officially established in 1916. The first parks were established, 1872 with Yellowstone, and the first national forests again also in the 1890s. They didn't call them national forests at that time. They called them forest reserves. But the Bureau of Land Management didn't come about until at least the 1930s, when free, unrestricted grazing ended. I believe it was called the Taylor Grazing Act, but basically all the land that was never homesteaded, they kind of stopped allowing homesteading, basically. And that land is certainly used by ranchers who graze their cattle and sheep. And there also is active mining and mining claims done on Bureau of Land Management land. There is also conservation and recreation as well. Generally speaking, it is sort of, the Bureau of Land Management is a little bit closer to the Wild West, if you will. You can pretty much almost like camp anywhere on Bureau of Land Management land, whereas a National Park Service, obviously not. There's a high demand for national parks because of their unique qualities that everyone wants to, go experience. But Bureau of Land Management land, you could, if there's no restrictions, signs restricting anything, you can oftentimes just like kind of pull over the side of some dirt road and camp, okay? But because of this, there's a little bit less what we would consider to be environmental or natural resource protection in Bureau of Land Management lands. Any kind of development of natural resources still have to undergo an environmental assessment review, but still, nonetheless, though, basically individuals or companies can do things like graze animals, livestock, do a mining claim. purchasing a permit. And but at the same time, like I said, it's has less restrictions on outdoor recreation, and generally most of these areas have very few people, and trails have very few signs and so forth. Again, you do have conservation lands on Bureau of Land and Management land. You do have official recreation areas that have some unique feature, whether it's maybe like certain canyons that are scenic or what have you. So anyways, so you will see that Bureau of Land and Management really is almost entirely a Western phenomena. Okay. Now, not all of the land that is in beige is desert lands. You do have some Bureau of Land Management lands up in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon that is forest, but still, nonetheless, though. And of course, you do have areas of tundra in Alaska that are also Bureau of Land Management as well. Okay, so the fourth big U.S. federal agency that manages lands for some kind of protection of the natural environment is the National Wildlife Refuge System. Now we're going to talk about some of the others, other federal agencies, but still nonetheless though, let's talk a little bit about the National Wildlife Refuge System, managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Generally speaking, the National Wildlife Refuge System are not generally as geared toward things like outdoor recreation. There may be hiking trails, but they may be more geared toward, bird watching, generally pretty restricted. There may be boardwalks through wetlands. Generally speaking, although there are some very large national wildlife refuges in many of our desert lands, nonetheless, though, many of the national wildlife refuges are quite small as far as units compared to the other three: national forests, Bureau of Land Management, and national parks. They may preserve wetlands of great importance for a lot of bird life, maybe a wildlife refuge for some rare or endangered species, but they tend to be kind of small. They may also be generally have a little bit more, certainly a lot more restrictions, generally fewer people because visitors, because again, and with the exception of those who are really specifically there to do things like bird watching, you're not going to find as many people. Okay, but yeah, you'll see a lot of national wildlife refuges. They may be fewer than 5,000 acres. Okay, which is generally a small unit of federal land. But like I said, there certainly are some large wildlife refuges in Arizona and Nevada and many of the desert lands, but generally they're going to be small and scattered around the country. Yeah, a lot of coastal wetlands, for example, are going to be that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what exactly a wilderness area is federally. Okay, so wilderness areas are not administered under one specific kind of federal agency. They can be found within national parks, national forests, Bureau of Land Management lands, or national wildlife refuges. So yeah, they were first established in 1964 through the Wilderness Act. And what sets them apart is that it has kind of the ultimate limitations of human activity in them. What does that mean? Well, that means that staff who manage these lands, if they have to not even use any motorized vehicles. Back when I was in college, I actually worked as a summer ranger for a small wilderness area on the border of Wisconsin and Michigan. It's called the Sylvania Wilderness Area, and it was an area of lakes, and we actually had to canoe along all of them. We couldn't use a motorboat. We had to canoe between all of them and portage, walk with the canoe from lake to lake. It was oftentimes only maybe half a mile between lakes, between lakeshores. And also, if trees fell down, we had to use no chainsaws, nothing like that. I had to only use hand tools. So generally, wilderness areas have restrictions on any kind of flying vehicles, things of that nature. So they're kind of like the ultimate in terms of protection. Okay. Many wilderness areas you may need a permit to enter, but not all of them. It really just depends on which ones. Okay. But anyways, you could, like I said, you could find them in national parks. So a lot of our most famous national parks, even the ones that get a lot of people, may still overwhelmingly be composed of areas designated as wilderness. For example, Yosemite gets a lot of people, but the over 90% of it is designated wilderness. Okay. All right. So now there's also another kind of federal designated area that can be found within existing federal lands or even outside of federal lands, and those are national wild and scenic rivers. The National Wild and Scenic River Act was established in 1968, so the 60s, 60s and 70s was obviously a huge era for environmental and conservation legislation. But it established wild and scenic rivers because this was an era that most of our rivers have been dammed and engineered to a certain extent at that point, and so there was a push to preserve whatever free-flowing wild and scenic rivers that there were left. So many of the rivers that flow down the western slope of the Sierra Nevadas of California are wild and scenic rivers. But once they flow into the flatlands of the Central Valley, which is mostly intensive agriculture, then they're no longer wild and scenic rivers. So basically, once they hit the reservoir, the lake that is created by the dam, it's no longer a wild and scenic river. So those basically, I don't know exactly the restrictions, but within a certain, it's a quarter mile on both sides, essentially there can be no development, whether for water resources or development of buildings or structures. So that's a wild and scenic river. Okay, there's two other types of federal lands that I will touch on that are a little different from the main four that I talked about, okay? And that is military lands. It's going to touch on those there, as well as Native American or American Indian reservations, okay? So just touch a little bit on the military lands. Generally speaking, as you might imagine, for the most part, military lands are off limits to the general public, almost exclusively. However, it's important to note that military lands, in many cases, are de facto conservation lands because you have all this area, even though they may be doing things like driving tanks or practicing bomb dropping or whatever it might be on the land. Nonetheless, though, you have a vast area that's completely off limits to any kind of human activity, whether that is using natural resources or whether that is development or any recreational pursuits at all. So in many places, military lands, military bases, oftentimes harbor rare, threatened, and endangered species that are not found elsewhere. That's certainly the case, for example, with the Pendleton Marine Base. So the Pendleton Marine Base is really the only extensive stretch of coastal lands between Los Angeles and San Diego, okay, specifically between San Clemente, California, and Oceanside. And it does harbor species that are not found elsewhere because that area is off limits to development. It's federally owned. It's military lands. So that's that. Now, of course, there also are American Indian reservations. Okay, and the history of why Native American reservations are where they are is obviously a long, extensive, complicated history that we're not going to get into today. But needless to say, the western states generally have the biggest. There's a few states in the east, like Wisconsin and North Carolina, that do have, and Florida, that do have some significantly large Native American reservation lands, but the West certainly has the most, particularly in the northern plain states of South Dakota and North Dakota, as well as Montana, which is more of a Rocky Mountain states, but 2/3 of it are more Great Plains. Oklahoma is a little bit of a complicated situation. They do have Native American reservation lands, but they're not fully reservation lands that are elsewhere. And then, of course, certainly in the Southwest, obviously Arizona and New Mexico has the largest, the Navajo Nation, but there's many others. There's various large Apache reservations, and and other western states. California has a lot of small ones, especially around like San Diego and Riverside counties. Now, what does this mean for recreation? Well, there is public outdoor recreation, certainly on Native American reservation lands. The rules, of course, are entirely set and enforced by the tribe. But you do have tribal parks, for example, several of them in the Navajo Nation, including Monument Valley, the Little Colorado River, and the very popular, especially become very popular with Instagram, Antelope Canyon. And so they oftentimes are stewards of some of our most unique natural wonders as well. So, but they're all different. So anything that takes place on those reservations, then you obviously need to do your research and so forth. So that's a little bit of an overview of, one other kind of, similar to a national wildlife scenic river, you also do have your national scenic trails, or in some cases historic trails as well. Most people are familiar with the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, which go through many states, through wilderness areas, and are popular with long-distance hikers and backpackers. But you also do have some historic trails, certainly in the east. You also have some lesser-known national scenic trails, including the Ice Age Trail in Wisconsin, the North Country Scenic Trail that goes from Maine to Michigan, or beyond, actually. But it's kind of similar into that the wild and scenic rivers, like it may actually go through private land, but right along the trail, like you can hike, but you have to be mindful of the fact that in some cases, scenic trails are, do go through private lands, and on both sides of the trail, you have to be aware of where you're hiking and walking through. So that's, again, a little bit of an overview. Okay, so to review, National Park Service contains national parks, national monuments, recreation areas, lakeshores and seashores. And remember, you do have national forests, national grasslands. All these other agencies are under the Department of Interior, except for the National U.S. Forest Service. That's under the Department of Agriculture. So also under the Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management, mostly the wide open deserts, the Wildlife Refuge System, and also the American Indian Reservation System. Again, that's I consider the big four, like I said, the Bureau of Land Management, National Parks, National Forests, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife, for those who are interested in the outdoors for the most part. Also keep in mind, we do also have some national marine sanctuaries as well that have restrictions on limitations of fishing, of other kinds of activities, boating, to protect marine resources, to protect fishing stocks, to protect nesting seabirds and marine mammals. And of course, you see that you have a fairly large one, extensive, from around the San Francisco Bay Area and going down along the coast of Big Sur, as well as here surrounding the Channel Islands, which are all entirely a national park. And there's a few others, of course. But those are some of the big ones. There's a couple other ones that surround the Florida Keys, even one off of New England, but the big ones are, of course, on the West Coast. Now, one last thing. So again, those are all federal. We're going to just touch briefly on state parks as well, because a lot of outdoor recreation, a lot of the enjoyment of the outdoors, conservation also takes place on state lands. Okay. Now, for the most part, state parks are relatively small. Okay. Generally speaking, a lot of state parks across the country in individual states are going to be under 10,000 acres, 5,000 acres, but it really depends. There are some that are quite large. Now, you do certainly keep in mind that different states are different. So unlike, say, federal lands, even though different national parks and national forests are all different, with state parks it's very different. Some states charge admission or entrance into their state parks. Other states do not. It really just depends on which ones. But a lot of the same rules apply. Certainly, of course, you just had to be aware of what those rules are. Now, of course, you do have some very large state parks, okay? In California, the largest state park is Anza Borrego Desert State Park, which is located between the San Diego area and the Salton Sea, which covers an area almost as large as many national parks. Okay. There's a few others that are quite large, like Montaña de Oro, which is a large state park along the Central Coast. But for the most part, state parks are small enough where on a typical road atlas or a road map of a whole state, they're only going to be represented as like a point feature, usually like the symbol of a little tree and maybe with a green tent if there is camping offered. Some state parks offer camping, others do not. So it's something to be aware of. Now, you do also have a few other unique exceptions. You do have, with state parks, the state of New York is really unique in that it does have two massive state parks that cover most of that state's mountainous areas, and that is, of course, the Catskills and the Adirondacks. They function a little bit differently in a way that is different from all other states. Okay. They do also have a lot of private land holdings within those parks, so it's a little bit complicated and a little bit different from just about every state. But anyways, to review, let's take a look at, again, on the national scale here. So as you can see, in the eastern two-thirds of the U.S., contrasts very, very sharply with the western one-third. Alaska clearly has some of the largest percentages of land that is federal. But among the lower 48, certainly Utah and Nevada have some of the highest percentages. And why is this? Well, basically it has a lot largely to do with geography. Okay, the country, generally speaking, was settled from east to west, and so and the western states have more rugged lands that were difficult to settle, and they were settled last, and that plays a big role. The land was not farmable. Even to this day, the land that is more arable, that has soils that it can actually be turned into farmland, are generally going to be all private. Okay, so in the eastern one-third of the U.S., you do have some national parks, but generally they are fewer in number and smaller, generally speaking, than the national parks in the western states. You also do have quite a few national forests throughout the U.S., through the eastern half of the U.S., generally in areas where the land was never really that suitable for agriculture, whether it's because of soil type, topography, climate, things of that nature. And within those national forests, you do have wilderness areas, but generally smaller than the ones you find in the western states. Generally, right in the middle part of the country, the Great Plains has some of the, adjacent Midwestern states generally have some of the lowest percentages of public land. For example, Kansas, Iowa have two of the states have no wilderness areas at all. Most of those states do not have any national parks of any kind. South Dakota does, Badlands and Wind Cave. And Texas also, with the exception of the far west, also have very little. And that's because the land was very suitable to farming, okay? Other states that have pretty low percentages of federal lands are many of the small states that were part of the original 13 colonies, like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, Maryland, places like that. So that is my little overview of the different categories of public lands, primarily federal lands, across the country. And hopefully this was a good little crash course for you. Again, you always want to do your own research. I highly recommend getting yourself a road and recreation atlas. Having something like this with you at all times when you're on road trips, you're going camping, is very helpful in case you want to do some searching for areas that might be a little bit more off the beaten path. You do have a lot of digital, electronic, internet resources, absolutely. Apps like AllTrails or what have you. But still, nonetheless, though, you'll be glad you got one of these if you really want to do some exploring on your own. So with that, I would like to wrap this up. And so hopefully, again, you will all learn something. And I will see you next time. And have a great day and Happy New Year in 2012. Bye.